and thanks everyone for joining us today. I would like to welcome Gareth Holebrook. Gareth is a Kaizen coach at Novavi Limited. He's a certified discipline agilist, and my tagline for Gareth is the Iron Man. He's got a lot of energy, and part of that energy comes from being a rather avid competitor and athlete in Ironman competitions. So, yeah, anytime we interact with each other, Gareth's in New Zealand, so it is just now 4 a.m. his time. I've worked with him early like this, and I've also worked with him where it's been rather late in the evening, or really early in the morning his time, and always a lot of energy, Gareth. So
Good morning.
yeah, we're going to talk about where do teams start. I'm going to just stop my share for a second so we can just get here on screen. And yeah, so Gareth, this is a really, like a lot of the topics we've been fortunate enough to have people come with expertise and speak on, one that's coming up more and more in the Agile community, just because there's more awareness of discipline Agile and having the ability to actually choose your way of working. But sometimes we find that teams are faced with, well, where do we actually start if we don't have a prescriptive approach or like a recipe or template for where we start? What do we do?
Yeah, that's really interesting question, because if you'd have gone back 10 or 15 years, people would have been completely new to Agile, especially tech teams. But now many people are at least peripherally familiar with it. So, and in many cases, people have already tried Scrum or Kanban. So it's not completely new. But also every team is unique. So often I go to a team and I need to assess where we're at. What do they know already? What have they been doing? And sometimes there's a non-technical team I've been working with recently, and they were completely new, but mostly people have a basic understanding. And there's two sides to that. On the one hand, it means we can spend less time understanding the basics, but also people can pick up bad habits and misunderstandings. So I really need to understand exactly what people understand to begin with, and then also look at what problem they're trying to solve. Are we looking at a big project that's going to take a few years? Is it a limited project or a limited work over 6 or 9 months? Or is it something that they want to get business as usual and start to move into that flow-based system? Or maybe it's some exploratory work. So based on that, based on the context, we need to then start evolving and moving to a future condition.
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to ask you today, and again, it's quite timely with this topic, is I had some discussions with some leadership team members at an organization this past week, and one of the things that they asked is they're exploring a bit more, a consideration for adopting DA. Is where do we start as an organization? They have some experience with Scrum, right?
Yeah.
Like a lot of organizations, they're looking to make inroads into having a more of a real adoption from an agile way of working perspective. And they have a somewhat limited budget, right? So some of the questions was, do we send everybody to training? Do we need to train everybody up front so that they have a place or understand where they would start? Do we bring in some experienced coaches and maybe do some training later on, but start with some coaching? Their concern is they want to make sure that the teams don't make some pretty significant decisions up front that
Yeah.
are going to be very hard to undo. So I know what I can provide, what type of guidance I gave to them, but what would you do?
Well, yeah, a lot of people do the air war, the training, put everybody on training, and it's high in intensity, but it doesn't have the consistency. And I like to think of the ground war. You can't just carpet bomb people with training. We need ground troops. The military metaphor. This is from the book Scaling Excellence by Huggy Rao and Bob Sutton. There's a few things. Firstly, Scrum is a great starting point, but it's also you can be very quickly get into a method prison where you're just following the process, and that's only part of the end-to-end value stream. It's only really the delivery model. So bringing somebody in as a coach to give guided continuous improvement, we can look at the options on the left-hand side, how we pull the work through, and how we deploy the work as well. So the that not just the construction phase, but the inception and the transition phase as well. So I would recommend little and often. So not spending a huge amount training everybody all at once. Training is definitely part of the mix, but the sequencing of when that training happens is important. So I would do it as a progression over a longer period of time.
Yeah, and that's actually really similar to how, I provided some context around what I would recommend. And it was sort of we need to do a little bit of this and a little bit of coaching, a little bit of training to be able to provide a pretty good starting point, especially depending on how many teams that they're going to get mobilized, in a given period of time, and see how well it's going to work. And
Yeah.
we've got our first question, and it's actually good because it's similar to how I wanted to sort of move a bit of the discussion with you. So Juliet asks, how often have you seen a team make bad choices?
Well, uh, I don't I don't know. Define a bad choice, because you have to make a choice, and the worst choice is making no decision at all. I think the biggest challenge is people who don't feel psychologically safe defer decisions. And the thing is, if we can make lots of small choices, then we can learn from it. I think teams have a tendency, especially technical teams, have a tendency to focus on the technology and don't have that intentional way of working. And over time, unintentional things occur. So, as a coach, I'm always watchful for how people operate, how they speak with one another. Um, but in terms of making poor decisions, yeah, we do all the time. But the thing is, can you recover from it? Is it a large decision or a small one? And how fast did you make that decision as well? Because if you make a quick decision and it wasn't quite right, you can always recover.
Yeah, and one of the things I'll add in that I've experienced, which is quite interesting, is where we've got something like Discipline Agile where we can go through and make a bunch of choices to use certain practices, or even really big choices like what type
Mm.
of a life cycle we're going to use. But I actually did have a team at an organization when I went in to do an assessment after they'd been using DA for a while, and there was a team that actually made choices that basically mirrored what they had been doing.
Yeah.
Uh,
Ah,
so,
so that's a
but
bias.
their
Yeah.
way of working was really not much change at all, which was not really the intent.
And that's the thing I suppose a coach should do is, and it's no different from a triathlon coach, right? Because I'll have those patterns of behavior, my swim coach, and he'll watch me and say, I can see that what you're doing is not helping. So then he will modify it. Without my coach, I'll carry on doing the same thing. And the thing I really like about disciplined agile is the deliberate nature in which you make decisions, and you record those decisions as well. And so you understand the rationale. So it makes you intently sit down and understand what you'll do and why you'll do it, and the impact, the consequence of that.
Yeah, and so Samuel has a question asking, if you choose your own starting point, how soon should you make changes after that?
Yeah, this is really good. So generally speaking, I like the agile approach to begin with, because it has the structure of the time box, and if you follow the Scrum framework, it has the events and the roles. Um, but then you may over time want to start looking at what's specific to you, and become pragmatic and tailor that way of working. But if you change too rapidly, you don't know the impact of your change. So you need to see the cause and effect. So it requires some patience. And I've seen a lot of teams who started out maybe using Scrum, and they try a few iterations with that. And then before long, they start using Kanban or the lean flow approach. But
Yep.
if you do it too quickly, then you haven't embedded those micro habits and the rigor that the benefit of Scrum is it does create that rigor of the retrospective on a regular basis, the sprint review, and the planning and the daily scrum. And if you're
Yep.
not careful, you lose that discipline.
So, how about the situation, since we're talking about where teams should start, and obviously, if we're using something like the Scrum Guide, well, we have a starting point, right? It's a
Hmm.
rather small guide. It tells you what to do, and to some degree when to do it. And now we have the opportunity for teams to make decisions that are outside of a prescribed approach. What happens when you can't get the team members to agree on what practices that they want to use and how they actually want to start their way of working?
Well, and this is where leadership comes in. And as a coach, I think is culture and that safety, and then there's the leadership, and you have to maybe shift the stance. So sometimes, if the team is new, I have to build trust with the team, and so I've been with them for a while. They'll believe in me that my ideas work.
Right.
Sometimes, teams may think it's too hard. I had a case once, this was years ago, and the team started to grow to be about 13 or 14 people, and it was too large. And so I've just read Heidi Helfer's book on reteaming, and we did exactly what she did with one of her teams, is to split into two, and immediately they accelerated, and they found it so much more rewarding. The meetings were shorter, and they had a greater understanding of what everyone was doing. But initially, it was a cognitive block that they said, well, we can't. How can we split into two teams? It's just too much work. So it takes some persuasion. It takes noticing the impact. But then it also, and this is where the coach comes in, you have an element of expertise and you bring to bear your own experience. And you say, I believe if we split this team into two smaller teams, I think it will be easier and we'll go faster and we'll get better outcomes. So it
Yeah.
becomes a conversation, and that's what the coach is there to do. So on the one hand, you want the teams to discover for themselves, but you want to point things out and maybe suggest things. And so the stance of the coach may ebb and flow between being more assertive and perhaps pace setting and more democratic and affiliative, depending on where the team sits.
Yeah,
And
and
it will
that's
change over
just such
time.
an excellent point, right? I mean, sometimes it's, you need somebody with experience to help push things along and sort of be that tiebreaker and say, look, based on my experience, here's where I think we should start. And again, we'll see how it goes, and we can experiment and change when we're ready.
Yeah.
But having that and having some bit of guidance to push in the right direction, and also identify some of the detriments that might come from selection, even at a very small process level, like the practices. And sometimes they're just not going to fit very well together for the type of work a team's going to be doing, or the organization they're in.
Yeah. So and I have to admit, sometimes I really push quite hard. I'm quite a pace setter, saying, "Look, team, let's just do it."
Yeah.
The team need it, right? They need to be
Yeah.
kicked out of the slumber. But only last week, a team was asking about the daily stand-up. How would you go about it? And I said, well, you've got two options. You could go around the room and everybody updates themselves, and that means you're sure that you've got the accountability that everybody speaks and you've got the equal airtime. But the downside to that is you spend, as a team member, you spend half the time planning for what you're going to say, and then the other half relieved that you've said it, and you're not actually listening to
Yeah.
everyone else.
Right.
So then I said the other alternative is that you walk the board,
Right.
and so you go on each work, and then everyone swarms over the work. And the benefit there is we focus on the work and collaborating and coordinating with the team. But the downside is if one member of the team is not actively engaged or not contributing, you may miss that. So I said, well, a third thing, which I've recently done with one team, is start with the whole team of what I've done and then go to the board with what we're going to do. So that way you can guarantee everyone talks, and also everything is talked about. So and I only tried that a few weeks ago with a particular team, but that was my own experience of the pros and cons.
Hmm.
And hopefully, if you can build that trust, the team will go, Gareth, what should we do? And I say, well, here's your options, and this is what I think we should do. And often, because I can influence, then they try things, and then, sometimes it doesn't work, and then we adapt it, and we have to be pragmatic, and we evolve it over time.
Yeah. Excellent. So Fabio asks, what sort of signs should you pay attention to evaluate and introduce changes in your way of working?
The rate of change. So, firstly, how much can the team consume? And that, in particular, when I go to a brand new team, is where they're at already. If they've had a really, really bad experience of an agile implementation, or they've had a method prison of Scrum and they see it as very bureaucratic and dictatorial, then obviously I'll take a completely different approach to a team who had never experienced it before. Um, Also, I'm always looking at the body language and behavior and language of the team.
Mm.
If things start to run awry, then you can start asking questions, not even just leaving it to the retrospective, but throughout the work, saying, I'm noticing people are saying this. What does this mean, and what can we do about it? One team, I remember it'd become quite large, and the testers started saying they quite a lot, and there we so that actually the testers and developers were two teams within a team because it was enlarged, and they didn't recognize that there's a single team who's delivering a shared outcome. So based on that, and picking up on a very subtle thing that what people were saying, you can start asking the questions and then highlighting it. And when you're conscious of it and other people are conscious of it, then you need to be self-aware before you can address it. So,
Yeah.
so I'm always looking out for what people say and how they say it.
Yeah, one of the things that I like to use is a retrospective board. So even across a short time period, like 2 weeks, if we're using the Agile life cycle in a 2-week iteration cadence, to be able to have items that come up that we want to talk about in the retrospective or candidate improvements. Keep doing this, don't stop doing this or whatever. And just from what I see going on the board, and then what I see and observe and sort of in the retrospective, that's also a really good indication of just, again, how well things are going. Are they coming together as a team? Do they understand the agile mindset, which is so important for
Yeah.
really making progress? Yeah, that's an area I like to
Yeah,
focus
absolutely. And the biggest question is there a retrospective board? And
on.
can you go to any team member and say, what did you agree to improve? Because that true Kaizen mindset is all the time. And it's not just at the retrospective, it can be hundreds of times per day.
Yeah.
And and you can really easily pick up, when you know what to look for, you can easily pick up on, do people have that improvement mindset? Or are they just in the red work? If you're familiar with David Marquet's expression of blue and red work, so red work is doing the work, and blue work is sitting back and reflecting and the cognitive, holistic thinking. And often we just get stuck into doing red work all the time, and we never sit back and do the blue work. And it should be red and blue quite a lot during the day. It's not just all red work throughout the iteration and then blue work at the end.
Yeah, that's one of the things I like about in the Foundations of Lean workshop. We play a game called, we have an exercise called the dot game, and it really focuses in on how you can just be so entrenched in what you're doing and to keep the flow of your work up, and you never step back and actually see the bigger picture and what's really happening.
Yeah,
So
I have to admit. So I did this with you back in, it was March, wasn't it?
yes.
So my background in lean manufacturing, I've been a production engineer. I know about theory of constraints, but you got me all going on that game, and I think I was a product owner in that game, and I was so efficient, and I
Yes, you
created
were.
such huge queues, and it's human nature, right? We want to do the best we can, but you've just focused narrowly, and and that's the red work. And what you need to do is stand back and say, what's the impact of this work on the bigger picture?
Yeah, yeah, and again, that's
That's
having a
just the
coach
thinking.
that's got experience to also be able to bring some of that mindset in, is just so beneficial.
Yeah, yeah. And so as a coach, I'm often in blue work when everyone else is in red work. And when they're in blue work, I'm doing my job, which is red work.
Red work,
So
yeah.
it's like a bit of a TikTok.
Let's see, we have another question from Fred. Would you recommend a train the trainer approach?
Um, yeah, I'll tell you what I think is the challenge I've had as a consultant. So I led an agile practice for 2 years in a fintech here in Auckland. But apart from that, in the last 10, I've done a lot of consulting. And the issue is they can become very dependent on my knowledge. And they're so busy doing the work that you can't transfer the knowledge. So when I go into organizations, I focus on the coaches and building up their competency so they can do without me, because otherwise, there's been a few times I've been at a bank for maybe a year. And then as soon as I left, those patterns of behavior start to unravel because there was a dependence on somebody keeping an eye on how it's working.
Yeah,
And that's a bad sign. That was a failure on my part, because a great consultant makes themselves redundant as soon as possible.
yeah, yeah. And we have a question from Barbie. If teams are learning a new process, for example, in a class, do they learn better on their own real work, or is it better to first have them use outside practice materials where they don't have so much emotion attached to their decisions?
Yeah, I like to abstract it away, and when you learn, it's better to action to new thinking rather than thinking your way to new action. But if you try and learn on the job straight away, the complexity and the cognitive load of doing the job and then learning a new way to do the job is sometimes overwhelming. So things like that dot game we play in the DA and the fundamentals of lean, foundations of lean, is important to understand the basic concepts. But then obviously software developers are not putting sticky dots on sticky notes,
Right.
but it's just to understand the basic premise. From that, then whenever we have another conversation, we can say, remember batch size, remember theory of constraints and not creating a bottleneck or a queue. So the basic concept is better learned in an abstract, but very quickly you want to learn on the job as well. But again, it's not big lessons all the time. It's just small lessons and just being there, having a conversation all the time and going through the trade-offs and the options you have on a regular basis. It has to be consistency. It can't
Yeah.
be big bang.
Yeah, and I've talked about this in some of the previous webinars. I mean, I'm a very strong supporter of training combined with coaching, and it depends on the context of a given organization or even just an individual that's coming into one of the certification training courses. But in my experience, if you have the opportunity to provide some foundational training, right, to get again some of that in the abstract, but then as you're getting ready to do a small practice or a new technique, having a bit of training and then immediately going in to do that work is oftentimes always more effective, just in my experience.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I recognize the value of the DA DALSM 3-day course.
Mhm.
We're working with some people with the PMI in Singapore actually at the moment, where we spread it over 3 weeks. And I
Mhm.
think the way you learn is fundamentally it's better to do it on a longer phase. I've also delivered agile facilitation and coaching over 6 weeks, half a day over 6 weeks.
Mhm.
And I think the way you recall is embedded because you go back on week 2 and you remind yourself of week 1. I think as well, you maybe have to do a big block to give a stimulation,
Mhm.
but then have the small training things like how to do planning poker or how to write user stories. I
Right.
wouldn't bundle it all together because people won't recall it.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. There's so much that we often both want to and need to cover in like a full day's worth of training. And then if you stack multiple days together, it can be a lot from a recall perspective. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's challenging.
I've read somewhere that the risk, many courses, these 2-day courses, 2 or 3-day courses, you can only remember 10-15% of it 3 months later. So
Yeah,
my preference is if I'm training that and I'd like to be coaching with the same organization for at least 3 months afterwards.
yeah.
Um, a lot of people just throw the teams on a course and say, "Great, congratulations, you're agile, off you go." I'm sorry, the dog's here.
Even your dog gets up early.
Yeah, she does.
So Axel asks, what about ways of working decisions regarding a lot of teams that are using large scale Scrum or the Scaled Agile framework? Who decides? How to enable afterwards?
Yeah, now again, and I've been at some larger banks, at least in New Zealand context. The problem is if you centralize authority and control, people don't have the information. The information is where the teams are. So
Right.
we need to very quickly create a framework of distributing that decision making. But then the sponsors need to feel safe that you're going to let the teams make the decisions. They're going to make wise decisions, and that's where the intermediary of the coach comes in. That's often what I do is I'll sit with the teams. I'll be a practitioner with teams, but then I'll have a seat at the top table. So then the executive are very familiar and feel reassured with what we're doing. Otherwise, there's a risk that people go off on a tangent or
Yeah.
focus too much on improvement and not enough on delivery. So there has to be a balancing act.
Yeah, and for those of you that haven't had an opportunity to work with a scaling framework, and by scaling I mean a teams of teams approach, that often gets into a fair amount of complexity, and the way that we can make decisions using Discipline Agile's program lifecycle, where maybe everybody's got a tightly banded approach where all the teams are using pretty much the same way of working, if not exactly, or we're in a situation where teams can actually make some small changes. Maybe they're going to not be using all the same practices or even really big ones. Again, within the program lifecycle, we see teams using different life cycles. Again, depending on how you can manage dependencies and again, the complexity of those situations. That's where we've talked about having a coach is really important to most teams, although with something like, Discipline Agile and it's the body of knowledge we have, that can be an enabler on its own, but coaches are going to add value. For scaling, in my experience, I'd say you really need to get somebody who's got experience with that.
Yeah, I would fully agree with that. I mean, my focus in little old New Zealand is I tend to work with organizations of fewer than 500 people. So that program level life cycle is probably too heavy for most people here. There's a few companies who have adopted it. But I generally, my personal sweet spot and interest is the team level practices and small enterprises. So the interdependency isn't huge between many teams there. I mean, the last big engagement I had, they had 5 Scrum teams.
Yeah. All right, we've got just a little more time. Let's get another question in. And Steve asks, are there teams that benefit from a mid-project restart, perhaps a repeat of Sprint Zero or Sutherland's shock therapy to reestablish discipline agilist principles in the heat of project activity and drift?
Yeah, well, this is it's like pulling the andon cord from Toyota, right? You sometimes you have to stop and say, "Is this working? Let's do a reset." So I mentioned that team that was 15 and they were hesitant to split into 2 teams. That was it was only not a huge project. I think it was like 3 million US dollars sized kind of project. But we did a reset because we were not firing as we wished. So we did some affinity estimating. We worked out how much longer the initiative had, and we found out that we had far too much work to do in the time we had. And so we then had to have a discussion about reducing some of that scope so we could hit the deadline. And then we formed the team. Of course, teams are constantly reforming. This is why I like Heidi Helfer's new book on reteaming. You can't. Tuckman's model is great, right? You form, storm, norm, perform, and you all work together for 5 years. Unfortunately, in the world we live, that doesn't happen anymore. So
Right.
you have new people entering, people leaving, maybe teams split or new teams merge. So having another reset and going through some chartering again, reforming the team, I think that's really important. It's an ongoing thing. I think Jeff Sutherland's shock for therapy is very intense, and I like to be very consistent. So I'm almost trying to reteam every week. Not that you'd want people entering and leaving every week, but you would be looking at the team dynamic regularly.
Right.
So if you're doing a big bang, it means you may have missed a few options and opportunities to pull that andon cord sooner.
Yeah.
In Toyota, you pull that cord 2,000 times a shift, right?
All right, well, I'm going to quickly share my screen as always. The time has passed just absolutely um, quicker than I always think it's going to. So, Gareth, it was a pleasure having you speak today.
Thank you
Um,
for asking.
and yeah, and there are some additional questions that we just didn't have time to get to. So Gareth and I are going to write a blog on this, and we'll get that out and try and make sure we've addressed the questions we've already answered, but the ones that we weren't able to get to.
Yeah.
Something else I'll mention is in the coming weeks, we've been working on a new forum, a bulletin board that'll be just open to the Discipline Agile community. It's one place we're going to ask people to send requests for webinar topics, or if you want to speak in one of these webinars, or questions as a follow-up. If we get a lot of people that are watching the recordings of the webinars. and they're emailing us questions, but we want to make it even easier and start some discussion amongst sort of the DA community. So that's one of the things we've been working on for months, and we're within probably 2 or 3 weeks of being able to launch that and make it freely available for everybody to get access to. So our webinar next week will be with Dealer Estebal's, and the topic here is a business executive walks into a DA meeting. So this is going to be more focused on executive leadership and a bit of what potentially you might see happen with that. So I hope everybody can join us next week for that. And as always, we have lots of training workshops that are coming up. This is just a sampling of what Glenn Little and I have, and I know Gareth and his two partners, Aldo and Horia, who have also been guest speakers on the webinars, have training workshops coming up as well. As you said, you've got one going on now with the Singapore chapter of PMI.
Yeah.
And with that, I'll thank everybody once again. Thank you, Gareth, and we hope to see everybody next week.
Thank you, Joshua.